witchy friends, and welcome to all new growth students and all old growth students for that matter. I hope you enjoyed your first lesson, and I hope it helped to give you the perspective for growth of what we mean when we teach Wicca. I'm Mackenzie Sage Wright, and in the pagan community I'm known as Sage, or you can just call me Mac if you like. Today we're going to go over two things: types of Wicca and types of books. Let's start with types of Wicca. The religion can basically be divided up into two categories: traditional and eclectic, or some people may call these traditional Wicca and neo-Wicca. The religion we know today as Wicca was founded in the 1930s by Gerald Gardner. Now, Gardner claims he'd been initiated into a witch coven, and he claims that this coven had been practicing underground for ages and much of the information was lost. But like I said, we'll get more into witch history later. Suffice it to say, for now, Wicca as it's known today can be traced back to Gardner's coven in the 1930s. Gardner established this religion, and we generally call it British traditional witchcraft today. You'll see it abbreviated as BTW. And his tradition, or trad, a word for tradition, is known as Gardnerian. It's an oath-bound tradition, and initiation is a requirement. Initiation into the coven, there is no self-initiation, so you have to be initiated into a coven to practice this. Initiation has a lot of rules. It goes from male to female or female to male. Someone who achieves a higher degree in BTW covens can what they call hive off. And that means they would go on and establish their own new coven because they're qualified now to be a leader, to be a high priest or priestess. And they could even start their new tradition. And this is how BTW branched out, and we got traditions like Alexandrian or Central Valley or Blue Star. They can all be traced back to students of Gardner himself, or at least they claim that they can be. Actually, some people argue where BTW traditions are lineaged, and you can draw the line. Some say that after Gardnerian and Alexandrian, the line is drawn. There are no other BTW trads. They're all eclectic. But that's for somebody else to debate. I'm not going to debate that here. The belief is that for your coven to count as BTW, or traditional Wicca, is that you have to be able to trace your initiation back to Gardner. So if you're John and you had to be initiated by Susan, she had to be initiated by Stanley, who was initiated by Mary, and yada, yada, yada. It just keeps going back until you get to the person initiated by Gardner and Gardner himself. So that is your lineage. While trads or even individual covens may differ, some in their teachings or philosophies or methods, you do have to uphold these initiation requirements to be considered BTW. You can't just get a book about BTW and start your own. With eclectic Wicca, which is the vast majority of Wiccans now, you're not required to be initiated. You're not required to have lineage traced back to Gardner. Covens aren't required to follow the BTW initiation requirements. Solitary Wicca is even possible. Covens will have their own coven rules or tradition rules for their trad, but it doesn't have to stem from Gardner or from Gardnerian Wicca or from that very first coven. Wiccan Way Grove, by the way, does teach eclectic Wicca. Sometimes it would be called neo-Wicca. That's kind of redundant to me, though. I can see why, with something as ancient as paganism, one might use neo-paganism to set it apart from older types, but with Wicca, it's pretty much all neo. So, now, you may have heard or read that there are some people who think you cannot be Wiccan unless you're initiated into the right coven. This is kind of a controversial opinion. Not everyone agrees. Not even all initiated BTWs, not even all initiated Gardnerians and Alexandrians would agree with this. There are strong arguments as to why eclectic Wicca is still Wicca, is a valid path. First off, the fact that Gardner never called his religion Wicca is important. And that's true. A lot of people don't even realize it, but Gardner never used the name Wicca for his religion. He called his religion witchcraft or the witch cult or the old religion, things like that. He called the larger pagan community of the Wicca, though he spelled Wicca W-I-C-A, only one C. And he argued that any magical folk were of the Wicca, but you had to be initiated, i.e. Gardnerian, to be a witch. When interest in witchcraft grew in the 1960s and 70s, more people began adopting the word Wicca, and not just those practicing Gardner's version. Gardnerians and Alexandrians were among those adopting the term Wicca, but it was never, even then, never exclusive to them. In fact, the initiated traditionalists once insisted that the term Wicca only be applied to those non-initiated because you had to be initiated to be a real, quote, witch. But the term Wicca started getting more popular. It had less baggage than the term witch. It seemed to be less threatening to the general public and sounded kind of mysterious. It's this older word because it was believed to have come from an Anglo-Saxon word, wick, which meant to bend. We'll get into etymology later. It's not confirmed, but it wasn't only Gardner's coven or lineage covens who were using this word. And by the late 80s, the word Wicca began to be used by so many different groups and even solitaries, and books started coming out on it that Gardnerians and Alexandrians reversed again and tried to distance themselves by going back to the word witch. And that's how the term British traditional witchcraft became the popular term for those lineaged covens in lieu of Wicca. And ever since then, they've kind of been going back and forth on that. Some eschew Wicca and claim to be British traditional witchcraft, and some still kind of cling to Wicca and say it's ours and ours alone. The thing is, words evolve, and no one owned these words, witch or Wicca. People use the term Wicca these days to mean any incarnation of the religion started by Gardner and influenced by many of his contemporaries. I see it kind of like Christianity. The Catholic Church founded Christianity as we know it today. The Protestant Reformation took the word Christian and started new branches, altering the original teachings a little bit, but still kind of holding true so that it's in the same vein. Concepts grow and change. That's what happens. There are also those who challenge BTWs, by the way, on trying to claim the word witch or traditional witchcraft. Someone who learned through a family tradition of witches might scoff at the notion that they need to be initiated into a Gardner-approved coven to be a witch. So really, it's just a tug-of-war by some over words that no one owned to begin with. And we continue to argue over definitions and refined definitions, and ultimately words are going to always be best defined by popular opinion. And popular opinion calls modern pagan witchcraft religions Wicca. Eclectic Wiccans follow that what's known as outer court teachings of British traditional witchcraft. We follow those outer court teachings because the inner court teachings are what's taught in the traditional witchcraft covens under oath. And it would be misleading to pretend that you were initiated into a BTW coven if you weren't. If you weren't initiated, you're not Gardnerian, you're not Alexandrian, you can't rightfully call yourself one. Eclectics were always a part of the growing Wicca movement and have just as much right to use the word Wiccan as any BTW, as long as they're not lying about some kind of lineage. Honestly, there aren't a lot of secrets that have not been made public one way or the other. Even Gardner's Book of Shadows is published and available for free on the internet now. I think it's great if one has access to a BTW coven and hands-on training and trains traditionally. And there's something to be said of that kind of discipline and knowing that the ones who taught you were properly taught and so on back through the years, and that you're part of a long-standing tradition that has a long line of knowledge accumulated and being taught the right way. But I tend to side with the opinion that Wicca is not owned by BTWs or any specific groups, which is why I offered you our definition in the last lesson of what Wicca is to us in the Grove, because there's no real set definitions. Like I argued before, I don't think Wicca is anything you want it to be, but I do think that we can argue about some of the specifics. And this is one where I take my stand on the side that Wicca is a more general term than just lineage-initiated covens. It's not to say that other people's definitions are necessarily wrong, but it's still debatable. So if you run into anyone saying you're not a real Wiccan, so realize that it's their opinion. It's a minority opinion, and you don't have to agree with it. Okay, so now that we talked about which is which, let's talk about books for a little bit. And I'm not talking about bookstore books or what books I want you to buy or anything like that. I'm talking about what kind of book you should be keeping for this course or as a Wiccan in general. There are a few different types of books or magical type book words you'll hear. One of the big ones you might have heard is Book of Shadows. That's the main one you'll hear in Wicca. It's a phrase that Gerald Gardner did coin, and it was basically the book that a witch would keep with all of his or her coven rules and instructions in it. Everyone would keep their own personal book. You could allow someone else initiated to copy some of the things out of your book, but the idea is to keep your own book. So when you join the coven, one of your first things that you would have to do is sit there and you would get a book and you would copy everything about the coven into your own personal book. Gardner was like really dramatic about it, talking about how you have to memorize it, and if you're in danger of being found out, cast it into the fire or destroy it or whatever, and then as soon as you're out of danger, you could start rewriting it again. And if your witch friend from your coven dies, burn their book so they won't be found out, and never have a book owned by somebody else if you're copying their work, because if they catch you, the witch hunters could catch you, and then the witch hunters could figure out who your friend is, your coven mates are by the handwriting. Gardner he had a flair for dramatics. He loved making the old religion connections and trying to make everything sound so archaic and everything. And you could argue that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that there might be a certain amount of danger in people finding out you're a witch, but Gardner was very public about it. So there were obviously no witch hunters and witch trials going on in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, at least not maybe in certain countries or areas like Africa. We're still burning witches, but not in the general Western world. It was not an issue anymore. And today it's totally different. We don't have to worry about that at all. We live in a day and age where people publish their Book of Shadows online. You could buy millions of books about witches and stuff like that. It's not an issue anymore. But it's still a good idea to have your own personal book. It's like your own personal Bible. It's sort of a journal and record keeping, and it's all about your religion and your religious journey and experiences. It's fine to buy or borrow a Book of Shadows, but never buy one or borrow one that's supposed to be your personal Book of Shadows. Like, you wouldn't want to use somebody's own Book of Shadows, somebody else's Book of Shadows in its entirety to be your Book of Shadows. You want your Book of Shadows to be personal to you. Although reading them or buying some and checking them out could be great because you get a lot of ideas and you may get some new information, but definitely you want to keep your own. Despite the fact that I'm making this decorative one, this artistic one, artistic decoration isn't really the point of your Book of Shadows. A pen and a spiral notebook is good enough. A binder's even better because you can organize and rearrange your pages whenever you want. And believe me, after a few years pass, the ability to do that every now and then is really welcoming. Decorate your book however you want it. Decorate it as extensively as you want it. If you do calligraphy, if you like to draw, if you want to do anything to enhance the look of your book so that you're proud of it and it pleases you to look at it, that's great, but those aren't the point. Above all, the Book of Shadows needs to be practical. I've heard of people who want to transcribe their Book of Shadows into runes or, these ancient runes or alphabets because they think it looks cool and it keeps it private if their parents come in their room and pick it up or something. I don't know. But that's great, but can you read it? Because if you can't read it without having to sit there and decipher it, then it's really not practical and you shouldn't do it. If you read in different language, if you read Latin or if you read ancient Aramaic or Babylonian or something like that, and you can read it fluently and you want to write and read your Book of Shadows in that language, have at it. But don't put it in a language you don't know or a dead language, or use runes that are associated with certain letters of the alphabet if you can't read them fluently when they're printed out on the page. Your Book of Shadows is not going to be a fixed thing. It's going to help you. It's going to change and grow as you do. Traditionally, it's handwritten because it helps you memorize what's in it, but I'll admit that certain lengthy passages, like the Charge of the Goddess, if I have to put it in a new Book of Shadows, I just reprint it and glue it in. The one that I'm currently working on, that you're watching while I do these videos, this is not my personal Book of Shadows. This is just an artistic one that I'm making. My personal Book of Shadows is kind of big and clunky, and they're always meant to be a work in progress. So it's been a lot of years, nearly 30 years or something like that. So yeah. Now, you should treat your book with reverence, no matter how it looks or no matter how you made it or what material you use. Treat it with reverence. It's important. Give it respect. And one of the ways you can do this is by not trying to stuff it with every magical thing you find on the internet. Don't try to fill it because it's going to grow quickly enough as you learn and study. And as a matter of fact, sometimes when they put this stuff in their Book of Shadows because they found it looks cool on the internet, they don't get around to studying it for years. So it's just kind of taking up space. Or when they finally do study it, it may be different than the source that they used to print it out on. So don't ever feel like you want to make your book bigger or more impressive, or that it's better to have a bigger book, because it'll quickly get messy and out of control with a lot of irrelevant things, and then it makes what's really relevant harder to find. So don't think about what can I put in my Book of Shadows to make it bigger or help it grow. What instead you should be thinking when you come across something that's of interest and of use to you in your spiritual growth and path, you might think, is this worthy of going into my Book of Shadows? Everything you put in there should have a reason for putting it there and not just taking up space or having a lot of cool witchy kind of writing in it. So be selective. Now, some people, I think it was Silver Ravenwolf who started this, but some people talk about a Book of Shadows or Book of Light. And the reason for this is that after a while, you can accumulate a lot in your Book of Shadows. When you're practicing for 10, 15, 20 years, it just keeps growing. And basically dividing it up into Book of Shadows, Book of Light is the way some people just try to keep it tamed. The Book of Shadows would be for the personal experiences and journaling. And if you cast a spell, you might want to write about what happened or how you did it specifically or detail. But the Book of Shadows would have all your reference information. So, I'm sorry, the Book of Light would have the reference information, and the Book of Shadows would be the actual personal experiences. That's one idea. I never used that, but that's one idea that some people use. So you might hear of a Book of Light, and that just so you know what it is. Another term you might hear is the term mirror book, and that's a book that you use for your active studying and research and note taking. So, like for class like this, you might use a mirror book as a notebook, and you're going to take notes on the lessons. You're going to do more research. You're going to write down your thoughts or your questions. As you're reading books, you might write down questions or notes like, I got to look more into this, or I have to look up this word. And then later on, you'd organize what you deem important into your Book of Shadows, but the mirror book would basically prevent you from cluttering up your Book of Shadows. You might detail all those spiritual experiences that you have when you're doing those meditations or those first rituals and whatever, and what you learn from them, and hence the term mirror, because it's kind of a reflection of what's going on. And it just is convenient, because if you just flat out use the Book of Shadows for note-taking of minute details, like I said, it can very quickly grow out of control. Although if you want to do that, there's nothing wrong with that. Some people have their Book of Shadows, their whole magical, religious, and spiritual journey is just in it, broken up into volumes if need be, and that's a personal choice. Another term you may have heard is grimoire, and the grimoire is traditionally it's an instructional book for ceremonial magic or occult practices, not necessarily Wicca. So you might try to obtain grimoires if you were trying to study the occult arts. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with spellbook, and as the name implies, spellbook is specifically for spells, and a lot of times that's what people who don't consider themselves Wiccan will use, just keeping spells instead of all the other religious stuff that they don't relate to. Some Wiccans will put their spell book in their Book of Shadows, essentially just as a section, and some Wiccans may keep it separate from their Book of Shadows. It's up to you. Again, it's personal choices. For serious students of the Grove, I highly recommend a mirror book or some kind of notebook for your scribblings, but I also recommend that you start a Book of Shadows and start thinking about what will go into that. And a lot of the lessons we go over will be points that some parts of that you may wish to inscribe in your Book of Shadows. For example, like when we talk about the Wiccan read, you may want to put the Wiccan read in your Book of Shadows, although you might necessarily not want to put every single note you took in your Book of Shadows. As usual, if you head on over to our Facebook page for Grove, you'll see discussions related to the lessons. You can ask questions, and we have assignments. So the links are below. Also, if you can help me out with a comment, that'd be great, because that drives traffic to my channel. You can be honest. I don't mind disagreement. Just, be respectful. Follow YouTube's TOS. No spam or harassing people and such. I don't like having to censor people, and I won't censor people just because of presenting different ideas, but I don't want any trouble here spamming links or people who are looking to argue or harass may not find their comments last a little long. But I appreciate if you make them and make them respectful. Be sure to like this video if you found it useful, share it or subscribe, and ding the little bell if you want to be a student of the Grove, so that you can get notifications when our new lessons come out. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you in the forums or next time on the next video. Till then, have a magical day.